Good evening and welcome to our December 10th Ogden City Council Citizens Academy Citizen Council meeting simulation. I'll let the roll call reflect that all council members are present, and we will have, tell me your name again?
Dave Graff.
Dave Graff, lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Please join us for a moment of silence. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is public hearing. The first was concerning the fiscal year 2014 budget amendment, the Harrison Storm Drain Project. And we'll hear from Ms. Eller-Smith, who will present to us tonight.
Thank you, Chair Heyer, council members. Thank you for letting me be here tonight. I thought that it would be helpful to maybe give you just a little bit of background, remind you where we've been to get to this point tonight. Back in 2008, the council approved bonding for water and sewer projects in the amount of $49 million. And it turns out it was a great time to bond because as a result of the downturn in the economy, we got lots of bang for the buck, so to speak. The recession made it so that the labor and materials we were able to get those at a greatly reduced cost, which means that the city was able to do more projects. And so that was really a great result of that. Well, one of the things that the finance department, well, I guess it was more the engineering department, hadn't anticipated was that when you have $49 million in the bank, you're going to earn some interest on that money. And it turns out that over that period of 3 or 4 years, we earned $1.5 million in interest. And because of the way the bond covenants were written, we had to spend that money, the city had to spend that money in a certain period of time. So we'd already done a lot of the water projects that were needed to be done, and during that same period of time, the engineering department was working with consultants to develop a sewer master plan. And as a result of that, we had some sewer projects that really needed to be done, and the engineering department thought that these sewer projects would be a good way to spend this money. The engineering was mostly done, and so that they could move forward with the projects there. So in January of this year, the council approved budget amendment to appropriate that bond interest and also pull some money from the retained earnings of the water utility and the sewer utility to do some of these additional capital improvement projects. So the water utility took about $2 million, and then the sewer utility was amended about $8 million. So I thought I'd just take a minute and review that project with you. This is the stormwater sewer project at Harrison, or what we call the Harrison Storm Sewer Project. It was originally planned to be done in 3 phases, and they were going to start with what you see is 2A for $2.8 million. And we're not engineers. We don't have the engineer to go into all the detail, but it's logical that you have to start at the bottom of a storm drain project, because if you're making something bigger at the top first, all it is going to cause more problems, more flooding. So they started at the bottom of the project, at the bottom of the hill with that project 2A. and then they were going to work up towards Harrison with the project on Harrison being the last project. Well, as a result of some work that UDOT did on Harrison, the engineering department was also able to work with them to get them to pick up a few of the costs associated with the work that they were doing. And so that's the project that we were talking about today. It turns out, as they did final engineering drawings and study for this project, that they identified some additional conditions that increased the cost of the project. The original project was estimated to be $5.8 million, and these additional issues added an additional $700,000 to the project. Those issues were that the condition of the pipe was much worse than anticipated, which meant they had to use some different remediation or replace more pipe than they expected. The dipstones were failing, and dipstones, we learned from the engineering, is just basically drains, any kind of a drain. But that they use that term to refer to a dipstone is the term they use to refer to drains. They also wanted to do ADA standard upgrades to the pedestrian ramps on the corners. And there was also additional utility issues that they had to resolve because some of this storm drain was going to impact existing utilities in the road. So what's before you tonight is this budget amendment to increase the money for the project. So increase the cost of amend the CIP to include the additional cost, and also move money from the storm drain utility, the retained earnings, into that project account for a total of $700,000. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Are there any questions for Ms. Eller-Smith?
Yeah, so the $700,000 is coming from the interest earned on the bond money while it's sat in the bank?
No, that money was pooled into the larger funds, so it went into retained earnings.
Okay.
And now we're taking some of the retained earnings. So it may not be the specific dollars, but it's some of that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
So, can you explain to me a little better where the $700,000 is coming from specifically?
So
Is it an enterprise fund?
yes, the sewer utility is an enterprise fund, so that means that it operates like a business. It's like we account for it separately from other city funds and other utility funds. So the stormwater fund operates separately. So when any money that's over that hasn't been appropriated to specific accounts sits in that retained earnings account, which is basically money that they can't spend until the council says they can spend it. And then once they identify a project for that money, they come to the council for appropriation to a specific project. And that's what we're here for tonight.
So I have a follow-up question then.
Okay.
So are there any state laws that dictate a minimum of what has to remain in that enterprise fund? How low can we take the enterprise fund? And when we withdraw the $700,000, what will that leave us in that fund?
And I don't have that specific information about what remains. There are not state laws about what needs to be retained, but there are bond requirements. Because we have bonded for a certain amount, we are required by our bond covenants to hold about 1.5 times
Okay.
our revenue in our expenses, 1.5 times our expenses in that fund.
Okay, and then just one more question. So is that enterprise fund currently cash flow positive?
Yes. I don't know exactly how much is in it, but it's in excess of $10 million.
Okay, and there's money coming into it, so we're...
Right.
Okay.
And the money that comes into it is from the sewer fees that are paid by the users, the citizens.
Okay, thank you.
Good questions. Any others?
I have a question. It says that the part of the expenses here are 300, that the city's portion of the cost are 300,000, and we're working to provide, or UDOT is sharing the cost. Do you, what's the amount that they're putting up? Do you know?
No, I'd have to ask the city engineer exactly what that is, but they would be picking up the cost for the, so generally when they're sharing costs, if they're doing a road rebuild or reconstruction, they're going in and they're tearing up all of the road and they're going to lay it down. So the road's going to be open anyway. So that's why it's a good time for us to go in. So I don't know exactly, the city engineer would have to answer that specific question about what UDOT is paying for, but part of those costs are the fact that they're opening up the road because they're there, and it's easier for them to do it than us to bring in a second crew to do the similar work.
And we're happy that they do.
Yeah.
Always saves us money. Any more questions? Okay, thank you. This is a public hearing. We'd like to hear your concerns or ideas about this project. If you have any, please come to the podium. Don't be shy. Well, seeing none, I would like to hear a motion to close the public hearing.
Motion to close?
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to close public hearing. This is a voice vote. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, do we have a motion concerning this, this proposal?
I'll move to pass it.
Okay. So, you move to,
To approve
approve
$700,000 to,
so you could say, I would move to approve ordinance 2014-35. And do we have a second? We have a second. And this is a roll call vote.
Councilmember Igo?
Aye? Do I say aye?
Yes.
Aye.
Councilmember Parks?
Aye.
Councilmember Graff?
aye.
Councilmember Smith?
Aye.
Councilmember Ukora?
Aye.
Vice Chair Lovato?
Aye.
Chair Heyer?
Aye, that passes. And so the next item is item B on public hearings, nomination of historic resource, vacuum exchange building. Mr. Symes, welcome.
Very much. Okay, well, thank you for letting us be here and present these items. What you have before you here is a petition to designate the vacuum exchange building and the site on which the building sits on the local landmarks register. And since we haven't had a chance to talk about this, give any background on historic preservation or what any of this means, I just want to spend just a couple of minutes to talk about the different designations and the results of those designations. So, so the two basic designations, there's a National Historic Register and the local landmarks register. And when something is placed on the National Register, the criteria for that, there's a fairly high standard to get on the register, but there aren't very many mechanisms for preservation. So it's really more honorary. There are some other things that are involved. We'll talk about that in a minute. Any potential resource that's related to American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, or culture must meet one of these criteria. So it must be associated with events, significant events that may have made or that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history, or that are associated with the lives of significant persons in the past, or that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or that possess high artistic values, or that represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction, or that have yielded or may likely yield information important in history or prehistory. Now, the last point up there, typically these things have to be 50 years old. So if there's something that is important that happens that you know, that everybody knows is going to be very significant, you don't necessarily have to wait that 50 years. So in certain circumstances, it can be less than 50 years old. On the local register, the standards are pretty similar, but the local register standards are set by our own ordinances here in Ogden City and each individual city. The resource designated on this register also has a fairly high standard, but unlike the National Register, resources on the local register do require maintenance, and they fall under the ordinances that we have. Any changes to the resource would require an approval by the Landmarks Commission, anything that would affect the resource's historicity. So a resource on the local register may be any site, structure, building, interior space, district, or natural feature, and it must have significant character, interest, or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, state, or nation, and it must meet criteria in one of these three categories. So historical significance, architectural significance, or neighborhood significance.
What makes neighborhood significance? What gives it that kind of a qualification?
Well, the neighborhood significance is I'm just going to paraphrase a little, but it's something that makes that particular neighborhood distinctive.
Jesse
or
James
something
lived
that
here,
stands out.
or
What's that?
Jesse James lived here, or
Right. So and that's one of the categories that this particular building meets. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. So the results of the designation. So as I mentioned, there are different standards and different results for the national and the local register. So on the National Register, the resource is listed as part of the National Register archives. The owner of the resource is obviously promoting and encouraging historic preservation. And probably most notably, the owner may be eligible for grants and tax credits and things like that to rehabilitate and repair the particular resource. The downside, of course, with the National Register is that there's no maintenance requirement, no use restrictions, anything like that. So aside from the tax credits, it really is more of an honorary designation. The local register, on the other hand, there are far better standards for that. So any of the resources are subject to the city's landmarks ordinance. It requires a certificate of historic appropriateness for any significant alterations that would change the historicity. The changes are reviewed by the Landmarks Commission and approved or denied based on the historical accuracy and the appropriateness of the alteration. And then any demolitions of a historic resource have to be approved and reviewed and approved by the Landmarks Commission, which is not the case for other buildings in the city. So if it's not on the register and somebody wants to take it down, come into the building department, get a demo permit, they can take it down. But if it is a historic resource, then they have to get approval to do that by the Landmarks Commission. And lastly, the historic resource is subject to what we call here in our city the demolition by neglect ordinance. And this is an ordinance that prohibits an owner from allowing a historic resource to fall into disrepair, either unintentionally or intentionally, and provides an alternative review process to investigate the neglect and allows for alternative agreements to be made to maintain and repair and rehabilitate the resource. So as far as the nomination process goes, any person or group or association, this would include the City Council, the Mayor, the Landmarks Commission, may nominate a potential resource. In this case, the owner of the property has petitioned to have the resource put on the register, and she's indicated that she would like to see that on the register to ensure the protection into the future. She hasn't owned this particular property very long, but the previous owner had talked with her a lot, and both this owner and the previous owner are very supportive of this property being on the register. So the proposal itself is to nominate the building and the site on which it sits, and the site includes the delivery chute that's in the sidewalk. So if you've ever seen that building and you see the metal box out front that goes down into the sidewalk, that's a very historic delivery chute that goes down into the basement. So that's a very important part of the site. It does not, however, include the billboard on the top or the shed in the back. So it's the building and the site with the chute. So when the petition was submitted, planning staff had a chance to take a look at it, and they did in fact determine that the building does have significant character and interest, and that the building has value, showing a historical development of the city. Staff also found that the building meets the criteria of 2 of the 3 categories that may be used to evaluate the resource. So in the category of neighborhood significance, the building's location on the corner of 32nd and Washington contributes to its prominence in the neighborhood, as well as the building's height and that very unique brick exterior. The building was built in the 20s and it was built as a 2-story, what we call now a mixed-use building. Most of the buildings built since then, especially in that area, are just single-story, single-use buildings. So this is a very unique building in that particular neighborhood. So as far as the historic significance, the staff found that the building is associated in a significant way with an important aspect of the cultural economic heritage of the community. The building still has its unique and historic delivery chute, which we had mentioned, in the sidewalk. Many of the buildings built around the same time had these chutes, but most of them have been covered up or filled in, and so to actually have one still there is pretty unique. And so the chute and the building itself, with its architecture and the particular style and the materials, are great examples of the types of buildings that were prevalent in Ogden and obviously throughout the country at the time. So just to recap, the owner of the building has submitted the petition. The city's landmarks staff has reviewed it. They've given a recommendation of approval to the Landmarks Commission. The Landmarks Commission has reviewed it, and they've also given a recommendation of approval to you for this particular property to be listed on the local register. So if you have any questions, be happy to answer those.
Are there any questions for Mr. Symes?
Yeah. Is there any benefit to the owner in gaining this designation from the city as a landmark?
Well, there are fewer benefits on the local register than there are on the national register. So as I mentioned, if it's on a national register, if you want to do a rehabilitation project, you would most likely be eligible for some tax credits or grants or things like that to help pay for that. The significance of being on the local register is all of the enforcement and the preservation that can take place. So there isn't necessarily a direct benefit, particularly a monetary benefit, for being on a local register. It's just a matter of protecting that resource.
You know, I drove by the building, and I understand the significance of its status in the neighborhood, and it was built in the 20s, and it was a mom-and-pop grocery store. I would contend that it doesn't resemble the business that it started out as, and that it's in danger of being demolished by neglect, which, you know, the place hasn't seen much physical attention in a long time.
Right.
It kind of struck me as interesting to read the rezoning request in our last case tonight, where things need to be cleaned up and yards need to be maintained and that sort of thing in neighborhoods, and yet something we're going to designate as historic doesn't display that.
Right.
And I think I just wonder what good it does the city to designate this particular property as a local landmark, a historic landmark,
Sure.
when it isn't going to be upgraded to kind of reflect that designation.
You may want to speak to to what the ramifications are of the demolition by neglect to this property. And you know, one of the things that we heard prior was was some of those issues with the condition of the building and what that really meant to the owner.
Right, and this is one of those things that's kind of a value judgment for the community. If the community values its historic heritage, buildings like this, then the benefit to the city is putting the full force of your local government behind protecting this building. So right now, because it's not listed, theoretically not listed on the register, they could tear this building down. There's nothing other than just basic property maintenance requirements that are in our building codes that would require this owner to make sure the roof doesn't leak. Whereas if we designate this as a local resource, then we can go in, we have that authority to do a little bit more, to be a little bit more aggressive in our investigation of that building, and to work with the owner to develop some sort of an agreement to maintain this building, to keep it from falling apart, and to maintain it into the future. When the city passed the demolition by neglect ordinance, there was a smaller appropriation of money. It was about $100,000 that could be used in cases like this. If we really needed to help an owner, if we needed to purchase a property, if we really felt that it was one that needed to be saved, we had a little pool of money that we could use to fix these problems. And the delivery chute is probably a good example of that. Now, this is something that was damaged in a car accident not too long ago, a couple of years ago. So there's some flooding issues because it damaged the foundation of that chute itself. And so there's some flooding issues down in the basement. And as we discussed with the building itself, it is going to be more difficult for the owner to meet the standards of something that's on a local register. But that property owner was willing to do that because they felt it was important to save it. So it is important if you as a council feel it's important to save the heritage, to save a building like this as an example of something that was built and that was characteristic of that time. It does take a little bit of money, but we do have the resources to help out if we need to, if you feel that that's important. Hopefully that answered your question. It was a very long answer.
Yeah, it's okay.
Thank you, that was perfect. Any other questions?
Yeah, a clarifying question, actually. So right now, this designation would put in place that they would have to maintain the building in its current condition, but not repair its current condition to improve the current condition, but you're saying that's something that the city can work with
Right,
the
that's
building
something-
owner to accomplish?
That's something they can work with. So they
Okay.
don't have to maintain it in this condition.
Okay.
So if they make changes, now, when you talk about historic buildings, one of the most important things that gets talked about is replacement of windows. I'll just use that as an example. Windows almost always have to be replaced on historic structures at some point, just like houses. But when you replace them, you can replace them with new windows, but they can't be period incorrect. So you have to figure out how to get a window manufacturer to make a window that is period correct to maintain that historicity. So the same with the foundation, the same with the chute, the same with the roof. You know, all of those things we want fixed because that's what maintains the building. But they have to be done in a way that maintains that historicity. And it is a little bit more expensive, but again, if we value that as something we want to save, then we're willing to do that.
Are there any requirements for the properties around it?
Nothing that's outside of our basic building maintenance requirements. Now, because this is a specific site rather than a historic district, those landmarks requirements would just be specific to this property. And that is a common problem and issue where you have a significant building in a neighborhood that could use some help.
Looking towards the future, if we looked at that area of Ogden and we looked at it for maybe a potential RDA or something along those lines, if we did designate this as a local landmark, does that mean that we would just have to kind of work around this building?
No.
If that were, how would that work?
Is your question specific to the purposes of an RDA or something like that, or redevelopment?
Well, if we were looking at that, if we were looking at that as an option for that area of the city, how would having a historic building within that center affect that project? Or would we have to work around it, or?
You wouldn't necessarily need to work around it. Most redevelopment agencies are really more, they operate more on an economic level.
Okay.
So if we had a business in there that generated more of a profit or increased the value of the property, that would be independent of its designation on the local register. And that increase in tax revenue would then contribute to the RDA, and those two things would in fact be separate.
And then I just have one more question.
Yeah.
So the landmark is tied to the building itself and not necessarily to the building being the vacuum exchange, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's the building itself and not the use.
Okay.
And that's a good point, because it did start as a grocery store, not obviously as a vacuum exchange building. But what the designation for, or what is for in this particular case, is the building and that site that includes the delivery chute.
Contracts does the owner of the building have with the billboard sign company? Is that
That
gonna
I don't know.
stay?
Those are, what was that last part?
I was just gonna say, does that billboard have to stay there?
Well,
Are
that's
they under contract?
Billboards are awfully tricky in cities. That was put in place before we had our current outdoor advertising restrictions. So in our city and in most cities, it's very, very difficult for a billboard company to come in and get a new spot. And so it's unlikely that the owner of that billboard would remove that, because it would be very difficult for them to get another spot. So that was done at a time when they could do that, and those are private contracts, and we don't know what the terms are, or what the deals are, what the revenue generated is, anything like that. But as of now, it would be a legal non-conforming use, and they can do it as long as they...
And this approval has really nothing to do with that. It doesn't
That's right.
require it to stay, it doesn't require it to go.
That's right. It excludes that billboard on the top.
And if I remember right, it's also the awning on the front of the building that has been added
I believe so.
later,
Yeah.
that all the little vacuums
Yeah.
were on, so.
Yeah, the vacuums aren't being designated either.
Yeah, I was trying to get that, I was trying to get that to be a part of the approval, but.
Although
Mr.
some of the
Symes?
vacuums are probably historical.
Yes.
I had one, you said there's a small pool of money available for these historic sites to call upon. Are any other sites in Ogden calling upon that pool of money at
Nobody's
present?
called upon it yet. We haven't, and that again, that's going through the entire demolition by neglect process, which is, it's a fairly involved process of having our building officials go and investigate the issue and trying to work with the owner to come up with some way to fix the problem, to rehabilitate the resource in a historically accurate way. That money could come into play at the very end when we get to the agreement stage, when we really need to fix something and there's just no way to pay for it, or if there's some really unique deal. It was kind of a last resort. So it's not really very much money if you're talking about a building like this. And so, I mean, to really be aggressive, we would obviously need a lot more money to deal with that. But it is a bit of a measure to try to address it. But to answer your question, there hasn't been anybody else who's drawn on that yet.
It was necessary to come up with this pool of money in order to get the demolition by neglect ordinance through.
Right.
There was so many that were, it would have been, the idea was that we need to have some way to protect the building if the owner just absolutely would not.
Right.
That really was kind of put into place just to kind of almost pickle a building until it could be refurbished or rehabilitated.
Right.
This building sits just north of Sandy's restaurant, right? Just curious.
I have a question. So if someone purchased this building from the current owner, they would take on the responsibility of keeping this up and...
They would.
and-
Mhm, that designation runs with the land. So any future owner would be bound by that. Because it's a legislative act, it's in front of you to designate this on the register. It's up to the council to take that off as well.
Any more questions for Mr. Symes?
Just one more. So if the worst-case scenario occurred and this building did kind of become dilapidated, then demolition does become an option. So, I mean,
It does, and-
we're not
and-
going to be stuck with a dilapidated building in the middle of.
That's right.
Okay.
And that's not an uncommon thing. I mean, for older buildings, they catch fire, they become structurally unsound. When it becomes a local resource, it does have to go in front of the Landmarks Commission to get the approval to demo that building.
Anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
This also is a public hearing. Would anyone like to express their thoughts or concerns about this proposal? Okay, need a motion to close the public hearing.
All motion?
Okay, do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second to close public hearing. This is a voice vote. All in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. This is a time when we can discuss this back and forth if you're not sure how you want to vote. Is there any discussion that you'd like to have about this prior to the vote? Yeah, I don't.
Or they went out of business, so.
I have no idea. It really doesn't have anything to do with this, but
I know,
Yeah.
but it's
Well, in the scope of the
neighboring.
neighborhood.
Yeah.
In the scope of the neighborhood.
this one was a challenge for me because, and I probably wouldn't have been too excited about voting for it had it not been the property owner that nominated it. Because there are some restrictions and some burdens on a property owner that they're going to have to take on because of this designation. And since they were the one that proposed it, I voted for it.
And she understands the full scope of her
He was
responsibility?
fully aware.
Okay.
You know, that was important for me to know, and she said, yeah, I fully understand.
So that foundation damage is reparable?
They have tried to mitigate that since that time, is that right? Yeah. That all those things go through landmarks and all that stuff, though, to anytime something happens to that structure.
What happens to a landmark building as far as tax evaluation?
Do you want to address that?
As far as I know, anything on the local register wouldn't affect its tax assessment value, anything like that. There would be tax implications, obviously, on a national register if you were to get the tax credits for the rehabilitation. But nothing, as far as I know, with the local county assessment.
Okay. Any further discussion? Okay, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll move to adopt the ordinance, the proposed ordinance.
Okay, 2014-14.
2014-14.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to adopt ordinance 2014-14. This is a roll call vote.
Councilmember Igo,
Aye.
Councilmember Parks,
Aye.
Councilmember Graff,
Hey,
Councilmember Smith,
Aye.
Councilmember Ukora,
Aye.
Vice Chair Lovato,
Aye.
Chair Heyer.
Aye. That passes 6-1. Councilmember, would you like to explain your no vote?
yeah, I think probably goes more to the, my understanding of what the historic, how the city defines historic landmark. I really feel like if there's something significant in town that's historic and worthy of that designation, then it should move towards some restoration and improvement of the property. And I'm not hearing that in this designation. I honestly and personally think the building's an eyesore the way it stands. And I think that it would carry more significance as the city's historic landmark designation if it were more restored to its original state rather than just preserved in its current state.
Okay, thank you. Next item on our agenda is reports from the Planning Commission. 32nd Street and Lincoln Avenue rezone.
I'm sorry, could you reintroduce yourself and what your
Sure.
role is for the city?
For the city, my name is Glenn Symes. I am a policy analyst. I work here in the council office. Just by way of background, I am a city planner by education and training, so that's why I get the rezones and the
Good job, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, well, this item is the rezone at 32nd and Lincoln Avenue. And again, we had a petitioner submit a request to change the zone. And their original request was to change the zone for their property there on the corner of 32nd and Lincoln. That's the property in the yellow. From the M1, the limited manufacturing zone, to the C2, which is a commercial, community commercial zone. So they're just quickly, there are three general commercial zones. There's a C1, which is the least intensive, the C2, which is medium, and the C3, which is the most intensive. Things like, heavy retail, shopping malls, things like that. That's the C3. So that's a fairly intensive zone. The petitioner, they would like to use this building for sort of an office warehouse for a property management business. So they would have an office and some storage of some, maintenance equipment, things like that. With the M1 zone designation, they could not have an office use as a primary use. For manufacturing, obviously you can have a manufacturing operation and have an office that goes with it, but you cannot have an office as a primary use. So they would need to change the zone to something if they wanted to do that particular kind of a use. So the C2 zone would in fact let them do what they wanted to do. So as the planning staff reviewed the petition, there were some other properties adjacent to that subject property that they thought could be rezoned as well. So the property to the north of that subject property there on the corner, they see as being rezoned to C2 as well. It's currently an M1. And the property to the west of that subject property, they had proposed to have that be rezoned from the M1 to the C3, which is that more intensive commercial zone. And the reason they had recommended that property to the west of the subject property be rezoned to the C3 is because the owner of that property and the property to the north and kind of the northwest there, that largest building on the western half of the block, there's the same owner for those two pieces, and you can see in this picture actually that user used that lot for some outdoor storage, things like that, and that's something that an owner could do in the C3 more easily than they could do in the C2. There's some outdoor storage allowed in the C2, but not nearly as much as the C3 because it is that more intensive zone. So this particular block, and the reason the planners looked at that and felt that could be rezoned is because of the Jefferson Community Plan. This is a plan that was adopted in February of 2013, and it specifically called out this area as an area to be rezoned. So if you see the black crosshatch on the image there, those are all the properties that are included in the proposal. So that includes the petitioner's property as well as those other properties that the planners felt could change. So you can see on the plan there that the community plan called for all of that to be rezoned to C2, and that was because the community that worked on the community plan felt that commercial uses, particularly that sort of middle intensive commercial zone, would fit better in the neighborhood rather than that manufacturing zone. There hasn't been much of any manufacturing use in that area for a very long time. So they felt it was appropriate to change that use designation. So as the Planning Commission looked at it, they felt that that whole entire area should be rezoned to the C2 to be consistent with the recommendation of the Jefferson Community Plan. The little piece of property to the west of the subject property, is no longer being used for that outdoor storage, so that C3 wasn't necessarily needed. Let's see. I'm sorry, I just lost my thought here. I'm sorry. The C2 fits better with that residential use that's south of 32nd rather than a C3. So based on this information, the community plan objectives, the Planning Commission forwarded a recommendation of approval to you to have all of those properties rezoned to C2 rather than split the two between the C2 and the C3. The proposal also, they felt, met the guidelines for rezones established in the city's general plan. And those, there's a more detailed discussion about those specific policy guidelines in your packet, so we won't go over those right now. If you want to take a look at that, that's in the Planning Commission report that's included. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Any questions for Mr. Symes on this proposal?
I do. It's off this particularly, but in the document, there was mention of a building that had, even though it was within this M1 designation, zoning designation, it had converted to office space. How'd they pull that off?
I don't know. There are a lot of mysteries like that in cities. I don't know. I'm not sure what changed or if it was a gradual change. Right. A lot of those things just kind of happen.
Yeah, I found that interesting.
Yeah. So the C2 would be much more appropriate since that's the actual use.
You've got some property owners that didn't request the zone change that are included in this.
Yes.
You want to talk to that?
Well, just sort of speaking in broad terms, you as a council have the ability to rezone a piece of property without the owner's approval. That's part of your police powers, your ability to make land use decisions in the city. We try not to do that very much because that's not always very good public policy. But in this particular case, most of those properties don't have any use on them at all. And we do as much outreach as we can. There's a notice that's sent for the Planning Commission meeting, which is the required public hearing, and then that noticing effort is duplicated at the city council level. So they get at least 2 notices. And it's also published in the paper and put in various places around the city, those notices that a meeting's going to take place. So we try to notify people so they know that their property is included in this petition, that they have a chance to come and speak, and there are numbers that are given so they can call the planners, they can see the information online. This particular case, we didn't have any comments from anyone. And so
This was including when they did the community plan.
That's right. Yeah. So the community plan is less than 2 years old. There was a lot of notification for that. These properties were identified in the general plan as properties that could change. There was no objection there. And then again with the dual notices for the Planning Commission and the City Council, and no objection there.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Does the rezoning have any property tax implications as far as?
Not necessarily at this point. It really depends on the use and how the county assesses that. Zoning has some effects on that. The county sort of has their own way to determine if there are going to be changes. So we typically, when we do a rezone, we stick at the city level with the land use policies as opposed to the taxation policies, especially for a piece of property that's this size. So I don't have any specific information about what the taxation would do if it would change. But typically on things like this, it's minimal. Not enough to sway one way or the other if there's a compelling land use reason to change.
It's hard to speak for the county ever. You know, you never know what the county will do. So that was a good way to present that.
Right.
Along those lines, and maybe this is not the topic, but because it's city, county, do they have to be notified of the rezone? I mean, do you provide that information to the county?
There's a notification. So when we do a notification, what we do is we do a radius. So we take the property, the subject properties, we do a 300 to 500 foot radius around that, send out a notice, as well as a list of what they call affected entities. So those are usually cities around, if it's going to affect a city that's adjacent, county, anybody else that might be affected by this. So there's the residents that are physically close to the rezone, as well as that affected entities list.
Was your question really about, once this rezone takes place, how does the county find out about it? Is that what you were?
Yes, along those lines.
Okay, I think that's what she was really talking about.
And unless the recorders do something that I'm not aware of, there's no specific notification that the county gets that we've done a rezone.
How does the city view the northeast corner of this? It's a power substation, which is maybe a little bit of manufacturing of electricity or distribution of electricity.
Right.
And there's I think probably an old building that maybe had to do with the operations that are there. I don't know if that's occupied. But if we're going to rezone this to office use, and yet this is on the corner and it's kind of looks to me like manufacturing, what do we do with that?
Well, when you get a use like that, a lot of the utilities, the public utilities and the quasi-public utilities, don't always have to follow the same city zoning as others. So sometimes it doesn't matter what the zoning is on that particular piece of property. They can keep doing what they're doing regardless. So we don't have much of a reason to leave that as a manufacturing zone to be inconsistent with the properties around it. We also try to rezone for the future. So if there was ever a reason this substation would go away, no longer be in operation, the preferred land use we want on that piece of property is commercial, as opposed to manufacturing. So rather than trying to get in there when that land use is changing, we do it now to plan for the future.
This wouldn't cause them to move.
No, it would have no effect on them whatsoever.
If you've got a use on a property and the zoning changes, they have what they call legal non-conforming, and they could continue to do what they were doing, whatever has been legal at the time, until they quit. So.
Okay.
So I have a follow-up question to that comment then. So you said that the majority of these buildings in the proposed area are not being used?
Right.
Was that your statement?
Mm-hmm.
So, but you said that there are some who would currently not fall under the designation that you're proposing? Or are they?
I'm not sure what the question was. Can you clarify? I'm not
I think
sure
what she
what
was asking is, are we creating any non-conforming uses?
Yes.
Not that I'm aware of, other than that substation,
Okay.
which is probably going to be non-conforming in just about every zone we have. So.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Symes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we would like to receive public input on this petition. If you'd like to come to the podium. If you give us your name and address for the record, please, and limit your comments to 3 minutes.
Yes, Bill Cook, 1073 East, 4925 South in Ogden. My brother-in-law owns the property that is in question. He's not been notified because he's a dentist, and he's been in the country of Mali going from village to village, helping people. So he's not been in the country for 3 months. He didn't know about this until I talked to him on the phone, and he said he's very much opposed for his property being rezoned without his knowledge, and he does not want that to happen.
Which property does he own?
Whatever it was that,
That one piece.
was on the list. I can't remember.
So did he not receive the notice for the community plan?
He did not. He's not received any of the notices, and he's violently opposed to you rezoning his property.
Okay,
Thank you.
noted, thank you. Anyone else? Now's your big chance. Please.
Well, you as a council, you have a couple of different options in this particular case. You can carve out that property if you want. If you feel that the noticing wasn't done correctly, we can renotice the whole process. You don't have to make a decision tonight. So you can put a stop to it, we can renotice, or you can carve that particular piece of property out of this proposal. Your third option, as I mentioned, you don't have to have the owner's approval to rezone a piece of property. You can move forward with the proposal now, and then we can talk to that gentleman, figure out what the problem is. If he really insists that it go back to an M1, we can bring that back to you, and you can rezone that back to an M1. So those would be some options that you have. So renotice, carve this piece out, or go ahead with it, and then we can revisit the issue later.
So is that something that we could, let's assume that it's the westerlymost property on the north side of 26th Street. Should we just call it that? Where the truck
The red
parking?
property?
Yeah, the truck parking was,
Okay,
okay?
sure.
So rather than to hold up the whole thing, could we table a portion of it for review?
Yeah, what you can do, so you can't expand an area. Well, technically you can, but you shouldn't based on your policies and good planning practice. You can't expand an area to rezone without notification. You can shrink the area without notification because fewer people then would be affected. All the people who would be affected then would have gotten all the proper noticing. So you can carve that piece out. You can make a notation in your motion to do all the other properties except for that one piece that was shown as proposed to be C3 by the planners. In that case, the ordinance itself would be redrafted with a new description that excludes that piece of property. You can, if you want, you can, again, we can renotice if you want to carve that piece out, we can renotice, and we can bring a clean ordinance back to you so you can make the decision on that, the remainder. The one issue with this is because this is a mixed proposal, so we have a petitioner who wants a zone change on one particular piece of property, and the planning staff added other pieces of property. One thing that might be helpful is to move forward with the petitioner's piece of property because that other piece of property is not directly related to what the petitioner wants to do. So you could move forward with the petitioner's original petition, grant them the rezone, exclude everything that the planners had recommended, and then we can revisit that and bring that back later as well.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments? All right. What is the pleasure of the council? Would you like to, how do you feel?
I think I like the last suggestion to just move forward with the petition to rezone this particular property and revisit and make sure all the other, especially this gentleman who's in Mali, gets a notification.
He's been in Mali a long time.
Do we know when he's going to come back from Mali?
He's coming back in 7 months.
In 7 months.
Okay?
That's a long time to.
There are a lot of teeth that need to be fixed.
And they're getting more rotten every day.
What would happen after, so if we did proceed to go ahead and approve the particular property that has been petitioned, would the planning commission come back and say, in 7 months or what, and say, okay, now let's go ahead and move to rezone these other properties as well, or?
I think the issue really is the noticing that's happened. And so how do we notice that and make certain that this property owner got his notice?
Well, if there's really an error in the noticing and it's one specific property and we feel confident that the other owners got their notice, we would probably make an effort to reach out to that person specifically and talk to that person and make sure they got the notice and make sure they understand the issues. So we do the broad noticing, assuming most people get it, most people do, but in those cases, sometimes we have to work a little harder. Make sure they get it. To answer that specific question as far as the Planning Commission, because they made a recommendation already and it sort of got stalled at the city council level, they wouldn't necessarily need to go back and make a new recommendation. So we could sort of keep it at the council level for a while. I mean, you don't want to keep it there too long without going back through the process so people understand what's happening. But you know, we could keep it at this level and not have to go back through the Planning Commission if their recommendation wouldn't change. If they're making a recommendation on the same piece of property with the same information, they're most likely not going to make a different determination. And they are a recommending body as opposed to the decision-making body, which is you. And so you don't have to follow their recommendation even if they do make a recommendation. So the council really does have the authority in this case. So.
Along with that, see, you said the planning commission is just a recommending, so if they're just recommending the changes, how does that noticing take place? Because you notify the property owners that this recommendation is being brought to the city council, is that?
Yeah, so we try to make them a little bit situation specific. So I'm going to talk just briefly about state law and the structure and why the Planning Commission does a public hearing and why the City Council just does a public input. So in the state code, in what they call the Land Use Development Management Act, they just call it LUDMA, if you ever hear that term get thrown around. The state requires each city to designate a body as the land use authority. Now, there are some smaller communities that where the council keeps that designation for themselves. So they have a planning commission, but they keep the designation, the title of land use authority with the council. In Ogden, we've designated our planning commission as the land use authority. So they have to hold the public hearing. So there are state requirements for noticing when you notice a public hearing. When we get to the council level where this is just a public input, we're doing this based on our own internal policies and not by state code because it was the land use authority that held the public hearing. But of course, we want people to understand what's happening and what's going on, and so we duplicate that same notice. The notices, we try to put information on there that says what's going on, so the notice that the recorders write for the public input meeting in front of the council says the Planning Commission reviewed this, they've given a recommendation of approval for the council. So we try to give at least a little bit of information about where the process is and what's happening.
That answer your question? Yes, thank you. Great.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question related to the possible delay of the entire rezone. So has your department done research about the change from an M1 to a C2? I assume there's a projected economic benefit to that switch. Is this going? You spoke earlier that most of these are empty. So I mean, is this going to be a more successful area of Ogden?
Right.
If we make this move and we're then delaying that?
It's hard to tell if this particular rezone is going to attract commercial use. What we do know is that the fact that it's been an M1 for 30 years has not attracted manufacturing uses. But again, I mean, as far as the planning and land use goes, we try to focus on what's best as far as land uses. The land uses in an M1 are very much incompatible with a neighborhood, whereas C2 uses are much closer to compatibility. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
It seems like that most of it is not in dispute, most of the property that we've been discussing. And it would seem logical to move in the direction to do everything that has been proposed that's not disputed. Anybody feel differently than that? The question is, what do we do with that? Feel strongly enough to plow forward and make that change, realizing that if we do make the change and the petitioner then comes back on the scene in 7 months, he would then have to pay a filing fee and go through the whole process to get it rezoned back to what it was.
We could do a city initiated. If that were the case, we wouldn't necessarily make a property owner pay that money to go back.
So we'd just run that through ourselves.
Yeah, we could do that.
Okay. So what's the pleasure? Any thoughts?
think we could just go ahead with it without that one particular property that's in dispute. That's,
Anybody feel strongly in a different point of view? Well, then I'll entertain a motion.
so would you still say the same name of the whole ordinance, even if
Yeah,
there's some?
well, you just call it 2013-45 and then articulate what you're wanting to carve out.
Okay, so motion to
Adopt.
adopt petition number 2013-9.
This is 45, I think, actually.
Oh, I'm on the wrong one. Okay, yeah. What he said. Minus the property, blah, 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 blah.
Okay?
Vested property. I second.
Just to be clear, the motion is to adopt ordinance 2013-45 to apply to all of the properties that are not in dispute, carving out the property of the individual that has, his designee has come and asked to be excluded. Any questions on the motion? Okay, this is a roll call vote.
Councilmember Graff,
Aye.
Councilmember Smith,
Aye.
Councilmember Ukora,
Aye.
Councilmember Igo,
Aye.
Councilmember Parks,
Aye.
Vice Chair Lovato,
Aye.
Chair Heyer.
Aye. And the ayes have it. Okay. Now, this is the next item on our agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity to address the council regarding your concerns or ideas. Please state your name and address clearly for the record and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Yes, sir. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Doug Stevens, 1131 16th Street. In front of my place, I have no sidewalks or gutter, and my street is falling to pieces. So when the snowplow will come this time, it'll probably take out a chunk here and there, but that's my dilemma. Thank you.
What would you propose?
Well, first of all, we need the road fixed, and if I can get curb and gutter,
Okay.
sidewalk.
Administration, would you like to discuss this with Mr. Stevens after the meeting, your proposal to solve this problem?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Any other comments? All right, seeing none. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I live on Monroe, and my neighbor's dog won't stop barking
Could
at
you give
me.
us your name and address, please?
This dog is crazy. My name's Amy Maybe. I live on 1620 Monroe, and the dog is harassing my family. It's harassing my husband every day when he goes to work. He's trying to provide for our family, and this dog just won't stop yapping. I don't know, Mayor, if you can go and talk to this dog owner, but it's ridiculous. I'm fed up. And they say it's legal to have him. I think he's violent. I think he's going to cause harm to my husband. We really need to address this issue.
Have you called and made complaints prior?
I haven't, except to the neighbors, obviously. I've written many notes to them, and they don't listen.
All right. Well, thank you for your comments. We'll see what we can do for you.
I'd really like that dog gone.
Don't take care of it yourself. All right. So another one. Would you
Yes.
make sure that
Maybe that's something you can take.
these are not. We laugh, but they happen this way, and typically it is something that we have no authority to do anything about, and so we just point the finger to Mayor and because they do have some authority to look into those things. Okay. Any other comments? All right. Comments from the mayor?
Yeah, I just want to say that you all did a wonderful job. You guys asked very good questions, and I think you guys all took this very seriously. So congrats to all of you. I also want to thank the Walker Institute in Ogden City for putting this together. I've learned a lot, and I think the rest of us have as well. So just thank you.
All right, thank you. Council members, any comments?
I second the mayor's comments. I've learned a lot. I've had a good time doing this and taking this class and learning these things, so thank you.
Okay, any others? I've got to first apologize for being tardy. That's going to dock my grade, I am sure. But I got to say that I was impressed by the questions that you asked. You obviously read your reports and came prepared today. It is a little scary sometimes to do this, but you get over it. You just do get over it. So, but this was really exciting for me to participate in this, and I appreciate you putting this on as well. I think that will help the quality of our election candidates in the future and all the communities here and nearby. But also thank you again for your participation. Look for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
I second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay.